Okay, so let's just think now where we finished off last time about how we do international market segmentation. And this again, this is a little bit what we talked about when we were talking about moving from country to country. Um, it really is a case of you decide your segmentation bases. So things like if we're doing GDP per capita, if we're doing the size of the middle class, if we're doing the level of corruption, and then we will segment our countries. We will put our countries into groups based on that. Um, and then this is what we'd call aggregate segmentation. And then we'd actually do disaggregate segmentation. Now, what does this mean? Well, it means that, say, for example, we found a nice cluster of countries we're interested in. So say we're interested in Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg. Then we will actually then segment the consumers within that country. So we might be aiming for, if we're a fashion company like Louis Vuitton, we might be aiming for higher income urban females. So first we decide if the segment's big enough, if we have enough wealthy people in the country, and we find groups of countries where this is true, and then we segment the countries within the country. So this is why it's called two-stage segmentation. Now what we've been doing is we've been doing kind of scatter plots here, and I'll just actually show you this with my whiteboard. Okay, so we've been doing, and this was a perfect slide to come back to, these kind of scatter plots for segmentation and grouping based on this. But imagine we were doing, imagine we were kind of segmenting cars. We want to maybe segment them based on consumer perception, so how exciting they are and how family oriented they are. Then we could also maybe, we have some measure of how safe they are. So we could have family safe, and we could have exciting and safe. And again, we've just got a load of cars, and then we kind of split them into groups, etc. That's our segmentation. Now, but the problem is each time we add a different variable, so maybe we've got a measure of how practical they are. And maybe we have a measure of, the speed of the car. Then we have, like, how environmentally friendly it is, so fuel efficiency. Now imagine we just had 6 different segmentation bases. The number of scatter plots is basically we choose 2 of these attributes at a time from 6 scatter plots. And we basically have, this is like combinations using your pre-calculate. This will be 6 factorial all over 4 factorial all over 2 factorial. This is just the number of combinations. So 6 factorial is 6 times 5 times 4 times 3 times 2 times 1. And so this is going to be 6 times 5. We cross that out. 2 factorial is just 2, and that's 15. So I'll put in big letters, this is not on the exam, in case I was panicking you there. But the idea is that suddenly we have only 6 segmentation bases, we have to draw 15 different scatter plots. So what we do is we do a technique called either principal components analysis, or the book mentions factor analysis. And all we're doing is we're putting all the information in these different scatter plots into one scatter plot. So we have as much information as possible. Okay. So I wasn't intending to stress you with that math, but just the idea is as we get more segmentation bases, it's kind of impossible to do it by hand. We have like, if we have 100 segmentation bases, we literally have millions of possible scatter plots. So we have to use a computational tool to give us, put all that information in one scatter plot, and that's called principal components or factor analysis. Okay, and if you're not shaking from too much math, here's just kind of the summary of our two-stage segmentation. We're looking for Louis Vuitton, so we choose countries that have, we find segments of countries that have got a decent size middle, upper middle classes, have decent income, low corruption maybe. And once we've got our segments of countries, we segment the consumers of the countries within their variables. And we can either segment based on observable variables. So this is like, what we observe. How often do people buy our product? Are they loyal to our product? And unobservable, which is attitudes and beliefs, which is things like, how do you feel about my product? How do you feel about Walmart? How do you feel about Louis Vuitton? If I ask you a question now, how likely are you to shop at Walmart every week? Those are attitudes and beliefs. Okay, so this is another little, we're now going to just do some examples of kind of some international country segmentations. This is another example, a little bit like what we did before. And this was based on a segmentation for Nestle done by the Boston Consultancy Group. And again, we have this is very similar to the one before, how strong we are in the country relative to how strong our growth potential is. So if we're strong in the country and there's high growth potential in the country, so for example, we go back to Starbucks. We have lots of coffee shops there, and they drink a lot of coffee. This is a star country. If we are high in the country, but we've pretty much saturated, we've saturated the market, then this is a cash cow country. If we're doing terribly, it's a bad market, it's a dog country. And if there's high potential, but we are low, we're not doing well in the market, it's a wildcat country. There's a lot of potential for us to grow there. So here's just a few different interesting segmentations we could do. And this is a segment for Johnnie Walker whiskey. It's a little bit out of date. So we have the mature markets, where we've pretty much, anybody who drinks whiskey knows about our product. There's no growth in whiskey drinking. And these tend to be here. This is like, the Western European countries, United States, the wealthy countries. We have the developing markets where we have growing economies. There's a degree of competition, but we see, there's growth for our product. And then we've got our emerging markets, which are a little bit, behind. There's undeveloped trade, which basically means it's going to be hard to get our product into stores. And by grey channel, remember I told you a grey market is it's the official product, but, not for your particular country. So we may, for example, ship some Johnnie Walker whiskey to Brazil, and then that's then shipped by a third party cheaply off to Chile. So now we move on to this idea of segmentation scenarios. This is just kind of a little bit of kind of almost a little bit of notation here, but we'll just go with it. I think there's some interesting concepts here. So we've got like universal segments, which are segments that, we find all over the world. And we talked about, with consumer convergence, these segments should be becoming more and more common. We have regional segments, and these are segments that just exist within a region. And then we have unique or diverse country-specific segments. So I will talk about positioning in a minute, but now let's just think a little bit about some unique or diverse segments. So we have Budweiser, and they have quite different positioning in the USA than they would do in Mexico. For example, in the US, they're seen as a common, all-purpose, very American beer. And in Mexico, they've kind of, sold themselves as slightly more of a foreign beer aimed at affluent consumers. Another example is Canon, and this might be a little bit out of date because very few people buy traditional cameras anymore. But they basically aimed for different segments in different countries. So they aimed for young replacement buyers in Japan, upscale buyers in the USA, and older and more sophisticated buyers in Germany. And then we kind of, reach back to our little matrix here. So if we have this idea of Canon, basically they have different segments. Look at number 4 here. So they're aiming kind of different positioning strategies to different kind of segments of the market. they're not aiming different positioning strategies at the universal segment. And again, another good example of kind of uniform positioning on a universal segment. This would be, for example, Nike. They have this kind of just do it kind of branding, and they have a very similar branding to in lots of different countries. They've got basically two adverts. They have their celebrity endorsement advert where they have a very famous sports person using Nike, and then they have an advert with people, playing sports with Nike products, on the street. So, for example, that would be pickup basketball in the USA. It would be soccer in, say, the UK or in Brazil. It would be cricket in India. So here's another example of a universal segment. This is kind of, and again, a little bit, my music tastes, I'm afraid, are a little bit behind the times. This is the MTV generation. So we have a generation going up on music videos all over the world, watching MTV. So based on that, they're going to have similar music and fashion tastes. We could think of, and again, in the current world, it's quite hard to think of regional versus world segments, because if you think of Korean pop, K-pop, which is a very specific kind of Korean type of pop music, but it's found fans all over the world. So it's a very big segment in Korea, but they've also found kind of almost a global segment of consumers who kind of, like K-pop. Another global segment, one of tech geeks who must have the latest technology, and technology is pretty much the same anywhere in the world. And we have international business travelers. So they, again, international business travelers will have similar needs all over the world. It's a very globalized segment. So they will have certain maybe devices that are aimed particularly at them. Okay, and you will get this on the exam. This is just kind of different segmentation scenarios. This is like a little conceptual summary of what we've just covered. So I'll give you a clue here. A is in every country, so this is going to be a global segment. B is in some countries, but not all countries. So B is going to be a regional segment, same with D. And then C, E, and F, these are going to be quite country-specific segments. Okay, so we've already talked a lot about segmentation variables. So the demographic variables, things like, household size, marital status, level of education, and they really do kind of overlap with socioeconomic variables. So things like per capita income, the size of, the general size of the economy, the amount of consumer spending, all these sort of things, are kind of metrics we can use to segment countries. And I think the book mentions a few issues, for example, with using some of these variables, that they may not be 100% realistic. A lot of developing nations will have a lot of cash-only transactions that are not recorded. There may be the grey and black markets in the economy, which again are not recorded. There may be some discrepancies in recording. Also, using something like GDP per capita does not tell you the entire story. We may need to think a little bit about the purchasing power parity, that if the current, as we've described before, if the currency is maybe undervalued a little bit, it may be that consumers have more purchasing power than we think we do. We also maybe need to think about, the relative size of the different classes in the economy. We talked about how India has a pretty low GDP per capita, but within the 1.3 billion people, there's this big middle class of 200 to 300 million, which can afford consumer products. We can look at that. We could look at socioeconomic strata analysis, is where we'll just split the country into different classes based on purchasing power, and kind of analyze the relative size of like the upper class, the middle class, the upper middle class. And we could also think a little bit about, general levels of development. As I said, things like overall kind of education metrics, overall infrastructure metrics, things like that. So here's a few examples of using different segmentation bases. I think this one's pretty cool. This is actually from Peru, and this was a segmentation for Budweiser. And notice in the left, this is like the class segmentation. This was actually popularized in the UK, I guess, being a class-conscious society. And we have, like, you know, the ABs are kind of the skilled workers, the doctors, the lawyers, the professors. We have the skilled manual workers and then the unskilled manual workers. Then we split into different demographic categories. We've got age, we've got gender, we've also got urban, rural. And then we segment based on, this was for Budweiser, how we use the product. Do we drink it in a bar? Do we drink it at home? And the different usage occasions. And then we kind of, you know, from this, we actually define our different segments and, you know, determine which segment, these segments we need to focus on and which are going to be profitable. So here's our little socioeconomic strata analysis. And you can see these Latin American countries. And you can see, for example, that Venezuela, Paraguay, and Ecuador are the kind of the poorer countries with quite high lower classes. You'll also notice that, for example, Chile has a very big middle class. So if we're aiming, you know, a product such as Walmart at the middle class, then this might be a good market to move into. And here's another little segmentation. And then here we're segmenting actually by the category of product or the benefit. So we're splitting toothpaste up into family, kids, multi-benefits, sensitivity, herbal, and we also have whitening and freshening toothpaste. And we look at the share in the different markets, and you'll see, for example, and how that share has changed over time. And we're comparing the US, China, and Mexico. And we can see, for example, that the whitening market is 30% in the US, about 9% in China, and about 2.7% in Mexico. I'm not quite sure what figures what the UK is, but I know people always make jokes about the UK having bad dental work. So I'm wondering what it is for the UK. Okay, so, and again, we've talked a little bit about this already. So behavior versus perceptual. Behavior is what you actually do, which is quite often, if you have this information available, this is actually the best information you have. If I want to know about your tea or coffee preferences, if I have scanner data from a supermarket, and I know, you know, how loyal you are to my certain product, for example, Folgers, how often you use it, we can, from this information, we can work out, you know, what percentage of the population use it. So all of these are kind of behavioral-based, segmentation-based. And again, we can think about the benefits, as we did in the previous slide, of the different products. Now, this is an example of lifestyle segmentation. Now, this is a little bit complicated, so I'm just going to give you kind of a simple example of a lifestyle segmentation. And what we're going to do is we're going to do a little split. We're going to have from kind of, and we're going to think about, you know, say, for example, people 5 years after you graduate in your 20s. And we're going to go from very kind of traditionalist, conservative, to kind of almost, and we'll name this like almost hedonist. And this is someone here in their 20s, they're thinking, you know, maybe more conservative. I've got to settle down, I've got to have kids, I've got to have a family. And this person is thinking, okay, I really just want to enjoy life. I want to travel the world, I want to find myself. And then we're looking maybe from what sort of jobs these people have, from blue collar all the way up to white collar. So we're basically, in terms of their lifestyles and their feelings, we're kind of segmenting these people. And again, we'd have people in here. And we could do this very simple segmentation where, for example, we could have a white-collar traditionalist segment living in the suburbs, a blue-collar traditionalist segment, you know, maybe working in agriculture, working in kind of rural areas, and then the same for this kind of global, kind of almost hedonist segment. And we could add additional segmentation bases. We could add specifically rural, urban. We could add a political affiliation, liberal, conservative, etc., etc. But that was just kind of a very simple example of how we do this type of segmentation. So let's kind of move back to the slides. And again, we're just basically based on your feelings, particularly in beliefs and where you live and what you do. We have these different segments of the population. So we've got doing well, doing good. I'm guessing these people who are like attached to work. My family, my world. This is more of a traditionalist segment. My life, my way. And again, this is more of the hedonist segment. They're more self-oriented. And we've got here from stable to active. So again, we've got these different segmentation bases, and we're basically segmenting the population. And we've got an additional segment here showing how these segments exist in different international cities. So that's that kind of idea of this idea of lifestyle segmentation. So again, this is just a little summary of these different kind of global lifestyle segments. Okay, so we'll now just go back to international positioning strategies, and I'll just do a quick example for this in my notes. So just give you a second. Okay, so imagine that we are Starbucks, and let's just say, how do we position ourselves? So we are Starbucks. What are my perceptions? So this will be done by a survey. And we might think, we're a quality product. We have a consistent product. You're going to get pretty much the same thing in every store. Maybe we're seen as a little bit staid or corporate. And we would do this, and we would do this maybe for our competitors as well in the market. Then we'd think of our positioning themes. And we could start off with an actual theme. So we could say, for example, the world's cup of coffee, where we're selling ourselves as a kind of something of the global. Or we could say something like, this was originally from the Pacific Northwest, this idea of coffee culture. So we could say something like, Seattle culture, Seattle coffee worldwide. So we'd make maybe lots of positioning statements, then we would choose one. We would determine how to market for this particular strategy. So, if we're going for a global brand, we'd maybe do a lot of global social media. And we just think a little bit about, how our marketing strategy would interact with our particular statement, our particular positioning themes. And over time, we need to just monitor how well our positioning theme goes. So that's just basically we need to position. And this is kind of almost a global positioning. This, we're kind of, we're a little bit, as we're going to talk in a minute, foreign culture, but we're also talking about getting a certain experience over worldwide. So it's maybe a hybrid. Okay, so let's kind of go back. Let's remove this. And let's return to our slides. So this is kind of how to develop a positioning theme. And again, I just gave you some examples from Starbucks. So we could think about the product benefits, like we could have a positioning theme like keeps you awake in the morning. We could think a little bit about the users. And it could be something like, helping users get to work since 1990 something when Starbucks started. And again, we could think a little bit about the heritage. So we're thinking about, Seattle's coffee or lifestyle. Starbucks will help you on the go, something like that. I do bear in mind that I'm a quantitative marketing person. I'm not a creative. But those were my best attempts at creating positioning themes for each of these attributes. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about cultural positioning. And again, this is something which is actually easy to write multiple choice questions for, so you will get a few questions on this. And these are these different types of positioning you have for your product. Global culture consumer positioning is branded globally as kind of a global product. Local, you're branding it as part of your local culture. And foreign is basically, and I'll give an example in a minute, it's built around a specific foreign culture. So it really depends, your product category, what you're trying to sell, a lot about consumer attitudes when you actually develop this sort of positioning statement. So here's my example. I've talked about this before earlier in the lecture. This is Nike, and their Just Do It theme is very much kind of something global about how anybody can get up and get involved in sports. As I said, they have the consistent advertising, either with a famous person, like a soccer player or a baseball player, or somebody playing a certain sport locally. So in a way, Nike actually adapt their theme a little bit for local conditions with the local sports. So, I mean, in a real world context, you're probably never going to get a really pure theme. But this is just a good example of global consumer positioning. Foreign consumer cultural positioning. Now, Swiss watches are considered to be the best quality watches in the world. So this is like a Chinese watch. I think it's Breitling, but it's given kind of a Swiss-German name, and it's positioned and, marketed. It's supposed to look like, a big chunky like a Tag Heuer or a Rolex watch. So even though it's a Chinese watch, it's almost being positioned as a Swiss watch. And that, again, is because Swiss watches are seen as being high quality and very much the leaders in the field. Now, local consumer positioning. And do watch this video. This is quite a fun video. This is a Heinz baked beans ads from the 1980s. And Heinz is an American company, but Heinz baked beans have been, a major British product for like a long, long time. And you don't get any of this advertising in the US. The bean products are very different in the US. And this kind of iconic blue tin and iconic, almost like an iconic UK product. And they always embed with the adverts, it's all about British families. They always embed their adverts in British culture. This, again, is an example of McDonald's. We've talked about how McDonald's actually adapt their menus with one or two menu items from each country. But you see, this is McDonald's in New Zealand, and they're advertising the fact that they're sourcing from New Zealand, and New Zealand's very proud of its agriculture, very proud of its beef industry. So again, even though they're an American company, they're positioning themselves very much as a local company. Okay, so the appendix now, as I realized, this class, we don't have any stats prerequisites. Some of you guys are still doing business stats 1. So we're going to kind of skip this. If I can find a nice, simple way of doing some of this technical segmentation in the homework, then I will do it. Just this idea of, we have like more than 2 segmentation variables. How do we kind of build these 2-dimensional visualizations, and how do we develop these clusters automatically? So I'll have a think about this, but this stuff is not actually going to be on the exam.